Greetings everyone, I'm TC Kirkham. Welcome to Permanent Airwaves, a new show I'm doing about radio and people involved with radio. And we're going to start off with a real radio pioneer. Oscar Hirsch was one of the earliest Midwestern pioneers. He started his station, KFVS AM, in 1925 out of his living room in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Over the course of the next 60 years, he would build it into a radio and television empire, and it so happens that the late Mr. Hirsch's great-granddaughter is a friend of mine, and I couldn't wait to talk to her about her family's involvement with radio and this incredible record-setting early start in radio for her great-grandfather. So sit back and enjoy this discussion with my friend Katie Blaylock, the operator of Vintage and Vinyl here on YouTube. And she's going to show off some stuff that she has received over the years from her family members that belonged to either her grandfather or her grandfather's stations. And we'll talk a little bit about the history of each. And you can also get a complete history of KFVS in the link in the show notes to a documentary they did just a couple of years ago. Right now, let's talk to Katie.
Well, and it's preserving this history and information for other people that maybe don't know much about it, which is very cool.
Yeah, and I mean, not that many people are big radio fans anymore, but I go way back, and history like this always interests me. Especially, we'll start off here, since I found out that your great-grandfather was actually one of the big pioneers of modern radio.
He was. Oscar Hirsch was amazing. You know, he was inspired so much by catastrophic events that propelled him into radio. You know, the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, he was just 16 years old, and he always thought that there could have been better communication. Why wasn't things in place for people to be alerted to get help, you know? And then the tri-state tornado in 1925, just 2 months before he was granted his license for radio, tore through the town and killed 600 people. And if people had been alerted to all of that weather or those dangerous catastrophic events, I think that it would have saved the world. And that was one of his big intrigues into radio, as well as just during the war. You know, he worked in radio in World War I, installing radios into combat planes in Paris. And I think a lot of that was really intriguing to him, but also being in France when he heard over the radio that the war had ended was just amazing to him, the possibilities of communication.
Right. Now, under the title, if I'm not mistaken, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, under the title Hirsch Communication Engineering Corp.,
yes,
Oscar C. Hirsch ended up owning 5 radio stations and a television station. The one that we were talking about, the one we're going to talk most about, was the Cape Girardeau station, which was KFVS AM, which he owned from 1925 to 1985, I think, is when the family sold it, right?
Yes, like right.
Eventually, he expanded to WKRO in Cairo, Illinois, KFMO in Flat River, Missouri, KSIM in Sikeston, Missouri, and WHCO in Sparta, Illinois. And also in 1954, they introduced KFVS TV in Cape Girardeau. He was very much a busy guy.
He was. You know, before all of this, when he came back from the war, he sold radio batteries to like farmers and things. And I just learned that from my cousin the other day, she was saying that he would go from farm to farm and sell these batteries. So that's why it's called the Hirsch Radio and Battery Company, because that's what he first did, which coincidentally, I was going through some ephemera that was sent to me by a family member. And this is when he had the KFVS early days of radio. But there it is, Hirsch Battery and Radio Company from 1929, this letter, which is very cool to see the letterhead there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Did he have any interest in was he more interested in the news aspect, or was he interested in radio as an entertainment medium?
I think mainly as a way to spread the news and to get information to folks that didn't have information. But I also know that there was definitely an entertainment element. I have this very cool picture of the KFVS orchestra that would play on the radio live.
That was his first. That was his first thing, wasn't it? The orchestra was the first thing they broadcast.
Yep, that orchestral music, because they didn't really have a lot, and most people back then actually didn't have radios. The first broadcast was in his mother's backyard, and the orchestral music and everything was done from their living room. And what was cool is most people, like I said, didn't have radios. So 300 people lined the street just to be there for the first broadcast because it was so novel and so interesting.
Radio hadn't yet really taken off yet. It wouldn't take off until the 30s when people started to get news and entertainment. And then, of course, really exploded in the 40s after Orson Welles and War of the Worlds and all the big band stuff. So he was there at the very beginning of all of this.
He was. And, he also was interested in just technology, I think, in general, and seeing progress. I remember my grandpa telling me that he was really fascinated by seeing Edison's light bulb display at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, which is wild to think that my great-grandfather was in a space where Edison would have had light bulbs and electricity was relatively new then. And to see that and be inspired by, progress and change and the possibilities of like, wow, what is the future going to be like? I think it's very cool.
Right. For people who don't know, can you explain exactly where Cape Girardeau is? It's in southern Missouri, and it's near it touches or damn comes close to touching 4 or 5 other states, doesn't it?
It does. And Cape Girardeau is about 2 hours south of St. Louis, for all of you guys that don't know. And it is a very small town. So most people actually have never heard of Cape Girardeau. Although I was at a wedding the other day and I ran into a lady whose family is from Cape Girardeau, and that shocks me. And we were talking and I said, my family is from St. Louis. And I always say St. Louis because nobody knows Cape Girardeau. And she goes, oh, I just went back to Missouri to visit my family. And she goes, we're from a tiny town, Cape Girardeau. And I'm like, you're kidding. This is wild because it is that small.
Well, right now it says its population is around 40,000, which to me, I lived for years in central Ohio in towns about that size. I never considered them small.
Yeah, I guess
small I grew up with was 500 people. So,
they're small, like the city that has the one post office, and that guy runs like the only gas station and post office small. But I still consider Cape Girardeau small-ish town.
Yeah, because you're originally from St. Louis, right? Or the St. Louis area.
My family is. I'm born and raised in Jacksonville, but
so you are originally from Jacksonville, okay?
Originally from Jacksonville.
And I come from Spokane. I live in Boston, so I'm used to the big city too. So
yeah,
it's kind of nuts. Let's show off some of that stuff that you were talking about from the radio station and the television station, because he was hands-on guy. According to the documentary you sent me, there'll be a link to that documentary in the show notes. But they said he was a hands-on type of guy that would roll his sleeves up and try to fix something before he'd order it or have somebody else try to do it.
Yeah, there wasn't really, Radio Shack back then. You didn't just go somewhere and pick up a part, like, oh, let me just run to the store, which, I remember very well from my childhood with my grandfather, who was always fixing things. But he did everything. He built everything himself. In fact, the first microphone, which I have here, was a double button microphone from 1920. And this was donated by the Lions Club, which is really interesting. So he got this essentially from them, and then a 50-watt transmitter he got from either a friend or something, and figured out how to rig it up, and then built a tower. And all the technical stuff's a little bit above my head, but he figured out how to make it all work with parts that were, around. And that's amazing. And then was always tinkering with stuff. I know that they had a big kind of storage shop area where stuff was always being fixed or repaired, which is very cool.
I know that tower that they built initially for radio, but later for the TV station, was the tallest structure in the world for a number of years, taller than any other radio transmitter, which I think is just amazing coming from such a small area where you're servicing mostly small towns in that area. And I thought that was great that they took that extra mile to make sure everybody had a clear signal.
They really worked hard on the clear signal. I know at first it wasn't as smooth, as you're getting the technology set up, but the 80-foot tower was built behind the Hirsch Radio and Battery Company, which was his mom's house at 312 South Frederick Street. And then later they had, in 1930, they had another one off of Highway 61. I think it was 128 feet, if I remember correctly. And then eventually they built the TV tower, which was huge. And it was the world's tallest structure. It was actually taller than the Empire State and the Eiffel Tower. But the interesting thing about that is the Empire State Building, they got a little bit upset about it. They wanted to be the tallest. So what they did was they built spires to make their tower technically taller. So this was the first pamphlet that came out on seeing the world's tallest structure. And then later they had to change it to one of the world's tallest, because the Empire State Building had a little bit of an extra height advantage due to their spires that they added.
Yeah, they did that to spite the Chrysler Building, too. I know the Chrysler Building was complaining about Empire State Building outdoing them by sticking those spires up there. It seems like that, one of the things that was brought forward in the documentary, and I think it was because, as you said, the tri-state tornado happened just a couple of months before he went on the air. He's always seemed to have or at least the stations he ran, always seemed to have the best they could when it came to weather technology. And as you know, I'm a big weather nut. I'm always telling people, watch the weather, because I grew up in Ohio. I know what Tornado Alley is like. It's that's something, especially in Missouri, where they've been hit numerous times just this year, including Cape Girardeau itself. That's got to be, I was watching some of the stuff that the television station does, and they were the first station in the Midwest to install their own Doppler radar setup in the 1990s or early 2000s. And that right there is something that shows that the money from at the time they had a different owner. Your great-grandfather wasn't involved anymore, but they kept up that tradition even under the new ownership. I think you said that kind of a deal is what made him even get into the business.
Yes, all of the potential to warn people, and when they had the early days of radio and television, eventually they would tell people, if you see warning signs of a tornado, call us, because they didn't have a way to necessarily predict tornadoes and bad weather events like we do now. But if people could call in, then they could maybe warn people ahead of time to take shelter. And they would often print these tornado bulletins and give them out to people on just safety, what you should do to prepare for storms like that, and to educate people, I think, was really important. And they were the first to have Doppler radar. I think they got Doppler radar before the National Weather Service, which is crazy.
That's what they said, yeah.
Yeah.
That is crazy. You realize I'm sitting here drooling at all this ephemera you're showing, because this is the kind of stuff that just makes me, I love that kind of stuff. I did find something. I'm gonna pull up the other screen if I can do it right here. I always hate doing this because I always do the wrong one. On the share screen, and I want to go over to this. Okay. I found this listing for his company in the 1958, I believe it was, Radio and Television Annual that the Broadcasting Magazine put out, and
Oh,
it lists the
wow.
Oscar C. Hirsch stations as Cairo, Cape Girardeau, and KFMO. And of course, he added two more to that. I always thought that was fun. I can't find the formats, unfortunately. I haven't had enough time to dig into that far. But I just thought that was cool. And it lets me know that if I keep going through the sites I use, I will eventually find more and more about his stations and such. So I think that's definitely pretty cool.
That
Um,
is so cool, TC, because I have looked for a number of years online, all of this wonderful ephemera I'm showing you. I didn't acquire it until recently. A family member was so kind to send two books full of things that my great grandmother had saved and was putting together because she wanted to write a book on radio, and I didn't have any of these items, and it's been a treasure trove. But for years I've searched online, KFVS radio, KFVS television, trying to see maybe if there's something on eBay online, and I haven't been able to find much. So this, other than the basic web pages that give you kind of a Wikipedia style information, this is really cool to have. So it's neat that you're finding more stuff about this.
I'll have to send you the link to my sites because I think you could probably dig through it and find stuff on him. Um, the the radio stations came first, and obviously he did get into television in the 1950s. He was a pioneer there too, going in 1954, which means he was in it from around the beginning of the first networks that had been around. Dumont was around then, as well as NBC, ABC, and CBS. Um, and I saw where it was actually affiliated with several different networks when they first started. Um, he does seem to have been an early visionary, both in radio and in television. He knew how important it would become to everyday lives eventually.
He did. And the first television station, their broadcasts were really interesting because they had two cameras eventually added. But at first, it was people reading the news with almost radio type technology, and then a slideshow of images. And people were writing in saying, "Hey, why can't we see your newscasters read the 10 o'clock news?" So he was very good at finding the technology when it wasn't probably as readily available or very expensive. So he went to an auction down in Festus and got two cameras from a closing TV station and brought them here. And that started the wonderful world of TV for him.
A lot of the stuff that they talked about in the documentary reminded me, like the slideshow reminded. And then you're not going to remember this because I'm an old guy and you're not, and I'm in the early days of cable television in the late 1970s or mid to late 1970s. Sometimes local stations would have what was called a weather scan channel, where they just had a camera panning across the dials of temperature, wind speed, so on and so forth. And occasionally, sometimes it would have just beautiful music playing. Other times they would have a local radio station playing. And I can imagine somebody from my era knowing what his first viewers were like, knowing, having watched something like that.
It must have been so cool for people at that time to see this technology evolve. My grandmother remembers sitting in the living room after church hearing about the bombs on radio, and that being something that was earth-shattering to people at the time. But then watching that technology come from being able to hear about it on radio to then actually see it on television and then later on in color must have been just incredible.
Yep. Now, did you get to meet him, or did he pass on before you were born?
He passed on a few years before I was born, so unfortunately I never got to meet him. I did meet my great grandmother. I don't remember her well. I'm actually named after her, Anna. But I was young when she died, so unfortunately I didn't get to know them. But I'm very fortunate that my grandfather, who worked at the radio station, their son, I spent a lot of time with in the summer, and he would tell me all kinds of things. So I just remember hearing these stories and being able to go up in the tower when they still had the TV tower. They had the 12th floor, and Grandpa, when I'd go to visit, would take me up to the office, and I remember getting to see all this cool stuff and hear about the radio and television. And I think that was just one of the best gifts that I could have ever gotten, was to get to learn through him.
That's cool. Have you ever spent time inside of a radio station, that just as a even just going through somebody's that your family knew or anything like that?
When I was a kid, my mom had an interview with someone at one of the local radio stations here. So I did get to go, which was very cool. And I've been in TV studios a lot, but not so much radio. But I always find it so fascinating.
Yeah, they have. I mean, they change so much. I haven't worked in internet radio myself, but I never got to do any real radio. Although I did have auditions and stuff at several stations, and so I was familiar with how they did stuff, and that's what I wanted to do when I was a kid, was be a DJ.
You'd be
So
a
radio.
great DJ.
Sorry.
You'd be a great DJ.
Oh, thank you. I worked hard at it. I did do it for 2.5 years with discjockey.com. And it was a lot of fun. Um, I imagine that that kind of thing is always moving forward. I mean, the technology that's changed. Even I'm old enough to remember the days of 3 television stations. So, when I was a teenager, we had, ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS, and that was it. Didn't even have any independents where I lived. So, and now, of course, you've got 300 channels and
Yep.
800 streaming things, and there's still
And
nothing on.
music channels and this and that and the other thing. It's just crazy.
Yeah. Have you been inspired to do anything by the all the different things that you know about how your grandfather worked or operated?
My grandfather, for sure. He was an electrical engineer for IBM, and he built some of the first computers, put in light emitting diodes, LED, which was very new at the time. I remember Grandpa was so fascinated by that, and then he'd talk about his experience at the radio station, and that for sure has influenced me now with what I do on YouTube, and all my love, I think, for industrial advertising and technical type stuff. I think all comes definitely from them. It kind of seems to run in the family.
Do you think your interest in industrial stuff comes from your grandfather's side?
I do. I mean, when I was a kid, I was probably the only 7-year-old that was getting a socket set for Christmas. I didn't want Barbies. I didn't want, makeup stuff. I wanted a Craftsman socket set. It had to be 80 piece, and my grandpa would go to Sears and pick it out. And so I had a home workshop, and Grandpa would spend all the summers with me. We'd build all kinds of stuff. And I had a locker shelf business with Grandpa for a short time. We built locker shelves for kids at school because Grandpa saw that there was a need for these locker shelves, because the ones that you could buy at the store then were very flimsy. And so we'd spend time. I'd learn how to, countersink screws and how to and we'd work with all kinds of materials, and I'd do electrical work. Grandpa and I would rewire lamps, or we'd figure out, all kinds of stuff. So I think all of that really is part of it. And then just tinkering around with parts and different things always interests me. And then now with the tools and the hardware stuff, as you see behind me, I think I love it.
Yeah, I've seen your whole apartment on the various videos you've done, and it is just an amazing collection of all different type of stuff, and your interests are so eclectic. Do you have anything else you'd like to show from the stations?
Yeah, I would. I've got some photos here and some really interesting things. This is a photo of my great grandmother, Anna, and she is outside of one of the first radio trucks for KFVS, which is very cool. And I've got another couple of photos here I found when I was going through stuff. This is my grandpa, Jim, who I was just talking about, at the radio TV station, which is a very cool photograph. And then this photo, I don't know where this was taken. I'm assuming that this was in the old Marquette Hotel where they moved to their second location, but
Hmm.
That's got a double button microphone as well. And that must have been one of the early setups, but I think that is so cool. And this is the one of the towers they had. I'm not exactly sure which tower this is, but there's the KFVS radio car
Oh,
tower, which is such a cool photo. I'd love to have this framed. And then the other thing that's kind of neat that I wanted to show is this here. This is a letter from the supervisor of radio in Chicago, Illinois, writing to or they're writing to the supervisor of radio from the Hirsch Battery Company. But if you notice, they're mentioning the station license, which is 1776. And I remember that number very distinctly because when I was a kid, my grandfather always thought that was so cool that that was the same year that our country was founded. So I
yep.
ended up finding, along with this letter, I found a renewal of the broadcast station license when they were on South Frederick Street, which is very cool. So there's all kinds of, it's a pretty lengthy
Oh,
application here,
yeah.
but that's a neat piece of ephemera. And the last thing that I'll show, and I'm sorry I don't have a better photo of this, but this is where the original station was in 318 South Frederick. That was my great grandmother's house, which is really cool. And we'll end with a photo here of Oscar Hirsch.
That's the man himself. Yep.
That's the man himself, which is very cool. The other neat, interesting thing, and I don't know if this was in the documentary or you may not know this, but he was a real pioneer in advertising as well.
Hmm.
People then didn't really think about advertising on radio or television for that matter. And he got a lot of local businesses to start advertising on the radio, including First National Bank, a couple of car lots, and they saw that this advertising could really work. And I'm not sure that he was necessarily the first one to do it, but I do think he was one of the first ones. And it was a huge success because the businesses would come back and say, wow, people are saying they heard about us on the radio. Which, now we just think is very common because there's ads, on everything. In fact, probably
Yeah.
5 ads before you can watch a video. But it was such a novel concept for people then.
Yeah, I actually have a series of advertised on radio spots I play on AM 70s every now and then that are just all from one ad agency, and they're trying to get you to buy commercial time. They're quite interesting. Katie, thank you for taking the time to share these memories with me about your great grandfather, Oscar Hirsch. I will have some links in the show notes where you can do some more research on this fascinating gentleman who was a true pioneer in radio in the U.S. and particularly in the Midwest. And hopefully, people will get to know him. And I hope you'll check out that documentary on KFVS TV also. They did a great job of spotlighting just how important Oscar was to the radio industry.
They did a wonderful job. Chris Conway, who's the station manager now at KFVS, is just delightful, and he did such a good job putting that together along with the team there. So thank you for having me. It's always fun sharing my family history.
All righty. Katie, thank you for joining me on Permanent Airwaves this week, the premiere of the show. I truly enjoyed our discussion about your great grandfather and would have been fascinated to meet him and discuss his involvement with this. He is a member of the Missouri Broadcasters Hall of Fame, and it's no big surprise. And I hope you found this interesting, as I hope you will find this show interesting. Every week we will be talking to somebody who has a connection to radio, either in the business, serving the business, or a huge fan of the business and what they do and why. And I hope you will find it enjoyable. Until next time, for Permanent Airwaves, I'm TC Kirkham, TKR Video Central. I will see you on the interwebs. Ciao, baby.